Chapter 23. Mauling. Through the open barn doors, Isaiah could see the morning sun glaring through a haze of orange and scarlet. Yet the light brought little in the way of comforting warmth with it. The unseasonable heat had withered away in the night, along with the rain clouds, and the damp of the storm's remains turned chill. The frigid wet in the air was knifing through him. Isaiah shivered involuntarily and felt the ancient wooden chair he was standing on tremble beneath him. With his hands bound behind his back, any attempt at balance had become a delicate feat. He steadied himself as best he could, trying not to let the gravity that was sticking his boots to the chair pull him through the rotting wood to the choking end that eagerly awaited him should it give way. The stiff hemp rope was taut and bristling, rubbing him raw, as if a billion tiny prick pins were stuck a millionth of an inch into his bleeding neck and wrists. Not for the first time, he mulled kicking the chair out from beneath him and having done with it. A couple minutes of choking and dangling, then he would be asleep. Death would rise up and pull him down into its comfortable embrace, and that would be the end of it. He took in the interior of the barn. Any notion of his suicide fantasy dispelled as he again saw his fellow occupants. The naked son of a bitch who he knew all too fucking well lay collapsed awkwardly, his slack, dead face stretched in a smile, his legs akimbo, flaccid little manhood shrunken and dangling like a crawdad astride a pair of walnuts. The other 3 dead Germans were likewise arranged, haphazard corpses dropped into rigor by the sun's rise. Isaiah knew that any death he brought down upon himself in the here and now would be a short-lived affair, followed by who fucking knows what. He also knew what needed doing. The only thing to it was to do it, as his father used to say. Isaiah gulped down the emotion that came with thinking of his papa. If the naked motherfucker was telling the truth about his family's fate, there would be time to mourn them later. Isaiah stood tall on the creaking chair. He arched his back and stretched his shoulders down in their sockets, making his arms as long as he could. Isaiah figured that if he was careful, he would get more than one crack at this. He needed to remain calm. He needed to work fast. He reckoned he had a count of 30 before he passed out and killed himself in the attempt if he was lucky. To be safe, he decided he would give himself a count of 10 before resettling and starting over. That seemed sensible enough to keep him safe. The first try was far worse than he imagined it would be. Isaiah lowered himself as far as he could until the rope was just beginning to bear his weight. He was not prepared for how much tighter the fucking thing got when he lifted his boots off the chair. He tried to raise his knees, and the choking got worse as he dropped his boots back down to the chair, nearly kicking the rickety thing out from under him as he regained purchase on it. The second time, he was mentally prepared for the weight and the choking. He got his knees up that time and fumbled his bound hands beneath his ass end, but he could not get them to swing under his boots. He started seeing stars. He barely got his hands back behind him and his shaking legs onto the chair, milliseconds before lack of oxygen would have shut down his brain. As he regained his equilibrium, he realized the boots would have to go. No way around it. He would not get his hands out from beneath his back with these goddamn shit kickers on. Isaiah sucked in a deep breath and started in on fixing the issue. The chair creaked bad when he brought his right foot back and stretched for it with his hands. Real bad, like it was going to go right to pieces beneath him. But somehow it held together. He got a numb, tingling finger through the rabbit ear of one of his laces and stopped himself in time not to yank it through. All he would get for that effort was an impossible knot. He shook his head at his near foolhardiness. The chair creaked again, but he held on to blind faith in whoever handcrafted the thing. He patiently felt for the free end of the lace. It slipped out of his grasp twice. Then he had it, pinched between his thumb and index finger. He pulled gently on the lace, and the whole knot slipped free, as if it had never been bound up tightly by the miracle of a double-slipped reef knot. He worked his fingers into the cross-lacing over the tongue and jiggled it all free. He sighed as the boot came loose. A couple flexes of his ankle joint, and it was dangling from his toes, then tumbling to the barn floor by the naked fucker's dirty foot soles. Isaiah let out a sigh of relief. Halfway home is halfway home. He put his socked foot back on the chair and lifted his remaining boot back toward his hands. The chair creaked loudly. Then it popped. The spindles and front apron split. The front legs collapsed out from under it. The cross rails fell forward and hit the back of Isaiah's calves, shoving him off into space, untethered and swinging from the rafter. Gravity had a firm grasp on him now and was yanking him down, choking him into its maw, resolute and fervent in its will. Isaiah nearly gave up and gave in. The temptation to simply let go of it all beckoned, warm and inviting. Then, through clenched eyelids, he saw the naked dead man who had strung him up there. A burst of rage shot through him. He might die today, but not by that man's hand. No, sir. With all the strength he had, he flexed his neck taut and rolled his knees up to his chin. The pain bit. Fireworks bursting in his brain. He fought his hands out from underneath him, nearly popping his left shoulder out of its socket as he dragged his feet through. His bound hands shot up above him and grabbed hold of the rope. He flexed his back and arms and pulled himself up 3 inches. 3 inches was all it took. A 1/4 inch of slack on the noose, and breath fought its way down his constricted throat into nearly collapsed lungs. He filled them with a tablespoon of air. The dizziness began to calm itself. Another careful breath. Then he climbed. Hand over hand, he used the strength he built in the cotton fields, which had been his open-air prison, to free himself. When he got 6 handholds up, he hung from his left hand. With his right fingers, he inched the noose up the standing rope until he could get the thing over his chin. Then he let go and dropped, surrendering to gravity's embrace, crashing down onto the remnants of the broken chair. He lay there and collected his thoughts. As those thoughts pressed down on him, he sat up. He shook it off. Thinking would not get him the fuck out of here. Deeds were his only possible savior. He hobbled up to his feet. One of the collapsed Germans still had his bayonet in its frog. Isaiah liberated it and used the serrated edge to saw his hands free of the rope. He sat by the naked German and pulled his boot back on. Had they called him Ziggy at the train depot? That could not be right. Ziggy was a goddamn ridiculous name. And he was pretty sure that that was not this fucker's name anymore regardless. He was pretty sure he knew who this fucker was. He was 99.9% certain that this fucker's name was Harlan Cox. How the hell Harlan Cox got here, Isaiah could not say for sure. Isaiah put the bayonet onto his belt, brushed off his trousers, and prepared to leave. He paused as he looked over the scattered dead. Behind them, on the barn wall, amongst other more mundane tools, was a sweat 16-pound maul. Isaiah had swung one, similar, back on the fields in Mississippi. It was a beastly fence-post sledgehammer, well suited to the task Isaiah had in mind. Isaiah spat on his palms and rubbed them together. He pulled the maul off its hooks and tested its weight. After he shattered the leg bones of all 4 dead men, he figured he had bettered his odds of outrunning the bastards on his bum ankle. As he jogged from the barn, he half smiled, imagining the sunset coming, these motherfuckers waking up, then trying to stand on freshly mauled tibias. Now that would be some funny shit. He almost regretted that he would not be there to see it. Years passed. On the same morning that I saw Isaiah Taylor, face wrapped in bloody cotton, huddled up in the corner of a boxcar, rattling along toward Atlanta and points north, his Aunt Jean made breakfast special. She cut the bacon nice and thick, gave it a coating of maple syrup, then treated it to an extra dark crisp in the fry pan. Not quite to charcoal, for certain, but it dealt enough smoke into the mix to make the salt and sweet extra pleasing. As was the way, Harlan was the last cox to the table. Despite his pomaded hair, clean shave, and starched collar, he still looked a bit done in by the last night's bourbon. Truth was, although he had worked hard to push away the experience, the death of Pearl was wearing on him. The only thing to do was pretend it never occurred. Daddy Cox set the Sunday paper aside as Harlan joined them for breakfast, mussing James's hair as he sat next to him. Mother Cox patted Harlan's shoulder. "You feeling all right this morning, honey lamb?" Harlan lit his face up with that charming, disarming smile. "Yes, Mother, on top of the world." She brushed back an invisible hair from his forehead, pecked on his cheek, and patted his strong shoulders. Jean brought coffee and biscuits first, then flapjacks with maple syrup, fresh strawberries with cream, and the bacon. Despite some rumbling in his stomach, Harlan ate it all. It was particularly amazing cuisine this morning, and he was grateful he could keep it all down without trouble. A few more glasses of bourbon last night would have made him miss the entire extravaganza. He still had a bit of rumbling in his belly and tried to settle it with one more coffee with extra cream. His stomach did not calm entirely, but he was fit enough to make it through church, he figured. The entire family piled into the Ford and made off for Sunday service at the Church of the Holy Redeemer. Jean knew her work well and had done it craftily. Her mother, Samantha, was Haiti-born free. She emigrated to the United States after the war, having dreamt that there would be a world of opportunity opening its doors wide with the defeat of the Confederacy and the end of slavery. To her immense, lifelong anger, Samantha's dream had been inaccurate. The Confederacy refused to just curl up and die. It received enough resuscitation from Lincoln's racist successor to lay in its deathbed breathing shallowly, taking gentle visits from its spawn, who paid their respects and inhaled its disease, eager to spread the virus far and wide. Samantha met and fell deep in love with Jean's father, John Bishop, a slave who had freed himself before the war's end by killing his former master with a coal shovel. They married and settled down. Samantha gave birth to 2 beautiful, healthy daughters. Perhaps her vision of a better world had not been entirely incorrect, although it had not played out in the way her dream imagined it would. Samantha raised her daughters well, taught them everything she knew about the world, the good, the bad, and ugly. Jean used all of her inherited knowledge that Sunday morning. As dawn was rising and Isaiah was sprinting alongside the northbound train, grabbing a handhold and swinging himself up to begin his trek into the wide world, Jean was assembling her ingredients and putting them to work. In Harlan's coffee, she put the dose of ground toad, organ meat. In his cream, a sprinkling of mortal and pestle-crushed knucklebone. In his flapjacks, a powder of black widow thorax and blue skink tail. And on his first bite of delicious bacon, a pinhead drop of dried pufferfish poison. At 10:30, halfway through Reverend Robert's sermon at the Church of the Holy Redeemer, Harlan started to sweat, just a little. The bourbon's unsteady lacquer in his belly made it rumble as it combined and struggled to digest all of Jean's cooking, along with her little additions. Mother heard the rumbling and patted his knee, mildly embarrassed. About 10 minutes later, he started feeling pins and needles in his extremities. When the tithing plate came his way, numb fingers dropped his money into the basket, then passed the plate on to baby brother James. James glanced up at him with a quizzical look of uncertainty. "Harlan? What's wrong with your lips?" he whispered and giggled. Harlan tried to smile at his baby brother, but his lips had started feeling some pins and needles too. "What do you mean, baby brother?" James giggled again and whispered loudly, "Your lips! Your lips turned blue!" Harlan smiled and tried to feel his lips with his fingers, but he could not. It was as if his lips and fingers had all gone to sleep. It was a very strange and oddly funny, painful sensation. He decided to stand up, still smiling that smile, through pale blue lips. By the time his legs fully straightened, he had already fainted. His jaw hit the wood of the bench back in front of him, scaring the dickens out of Mrs. Rose and knocking her best church bonnet askew and sending his front teeth clean through his tongue. But Harlan Cox did not feel a thing. When his mind woke back up, he could feel plenty, but he could not move in the slightest. He found himself buck naked on the slab at the Cox County mortuary, where they were getting him ready for his final resting place. Mama Samantha's Haitian toxins had worked a treat. Harlan never spoke again, but inside his mind, he was screaming his heart out. He felt them glue his eyes shut. They dolled him up in the same Sunday suit he'd collapsed in. He felt them slide his beautiful birthday pocket watch into his vest. He felt them paint his face and pomade his hair. He could tell that they had missed his part, but that was not the most upsetting thing by far. They heaved him up on the count of 3 and lowered him into a casket. Behind his glued eyelids, while a pipe organ that Daddy Cox had paid for with cash played "What a Friend We Have in Jesus," Harlan heard everyone moseying past his coffin and paying their doleful respects. Mother had been inconsolable, which sounded like it was the one thing that had kept Daddy Cox from breaking down entirely too. Dear young baby brother James Cox was the last one there, and for a brief moment Harlan was heartbroken, not just for himself, but for his little brother, now all alone in the world. James hugged him as tight as he could, tears pouring out of him. He mussed Harlan's hair with his grief, and Harlan felt slight annoyance that he could not move his hands reflexively to fix it. Then his brother's hand was rubbing his chest. The hand moved inside his suit coat. Harlan felt the little son of a bitching bastard put his grubby fingers around the pocket watch that Daddy had presented him on his 18th birthday and filched the thing out of his waistcoat. He heard James blubbering and crying all the way out of the church. Then he was alone. All that remained were the sounds of the lid shutting, the 3-inch nails driving it home, then the murmurs as his father, Donnie McMaster, and the good old boys from school, working together as pallbearers, hefted, then lugged his coffin, swaying to the boneyard. The screaming in his head started again as he listened to the final words from the preacher and heard the handfuls of dirt hitting his wooden tomb. They left him all by his lonesome for a time. The screaming in his head turned to weeping. Then the shovelfuls of dirt started raining down in earnest. 12 hours later, movement returned to his limbs. He screamed and cried and lost his mind. An hour later, he'd used up all the oxygen in the box. After a brief life of ease and privilege and a long, tortuous death, Harlan Cox was finally resting in peace. For a short time, at least.